Hi, welcome to the video on Web Service Debugging, part of our series on Tableau's Web Data Connector. We've got other videos focused on the Web Data Connector for developers, and this one is going to walk through a few tips and tricks when you're getting started. So one of the things that we see people struggle with sometimes when they're building their data connectors, they want to just jump right in and start getting data into Tableau, but they're not aware of the types of authentication that may be used on the particular data source to which they want to connect. So I'm going to spend a couple moments here. No authentication is actually the easiest to deal with, obviously. There's no hoops to jump through. So the level of difficulty here I'm indicating is none. So let's jump over and take a look at an example here. This here is Socrata.com. They host a lot of data and APIs for government data, open data, and whatnot. So by default, you can just go, you can type in, or you can connect to the URL, you can pass in query string parameters, and you can get back JSON for your application. They also have this nice discovery tool called the Open Data Network, where I can come in and say, hey, I'm interested in education data, and I can go and look and get, there looks like the state of Connecticut and city of New York. Lots of open data here available for you, and it's super easy to connect to. Keep in mind that Socrata will throttle connections after a certain number of queries are made, and if you run into that, they have a really easy registration process and you can get a token. So the next type of authentication to mention here is called basic authentication, also known as username and password. This is, you do have to make some considerations here in your app. So the level of difficulty I'm assigning that is one frowning baby. Got that photo courtesy of Donnie Ray Jones on Flickr. An example of this is the Tableau REST API actually uses username and password to authenticate, and then it returns you back a token, and you use that token for subsequent API requests. So it's closely related to the next form here called token, or sometimes you'll hear API providers call this API keys. I also assign this the same level of difficulty as basic, so you have to do some things, but it's not super difficult. The example I have for this one is a service called Forecast.io. They have a well-known weather application called Dark Skies on mobile, and you can see here on their developer docs page, once you register, they give you a key. You then pass that API key, or again, token, into every request that you make to their API. So very straightforward to work with tokens. Finally, the last example of commonly used authentication that we see with these web APIs is called Oauth. Latest version is Oauth 2.0. I've assigned this 3 frowning babies as the level of difficulty. Some people out there might argue and say, no, it's actually harder than that. But there are some things that you have to do. One of the biggest things, namely being protect your secrets, and oftentimes you'll see people do this via a proxy server. So I'm just going to show the Fitbit site here for a moment. I already have an application that uses the Fitbit API, but you would come in, typically if an API provider is using Oauth, they're going to collect some basic information from you about your name and email, and callback URL is actually one of the key things. This is so that when they call back to you, they call back to a known spot or a known URL to prevent any kind of security issues. There's kind of a common flow to Oauth. We've got another video in our series here about Oauth. It takes you through a tutorial that we put together, so it'll really show you how you can implement Oauth 2 in your web data connector, again, if your data source requires that. Let's take a look at some tools that are commonly used or maybe very useful for you to use. Some of the bigger API providers out there have a built-in debugging environment. You might hear this called an explorer or a playground. You'll see this from folks like Facebook and Google and other API providers. And it's a nice way to just go into that environment and do debugging and testing and explore those APIs. And so look for those because they are really useful, especially when you're ramping up with a new API. Another tool that's commonly used for debugging authentication and connection issues would be curl. Any command line fans out there should be well acquainted with curl. It's going to be in most Linux distros. It's in OS 10 on the Mac. And then you can also download it here from this website and install it on Windows and use it. If you're more of a visual person, less command line inclined, you could use a tool like Fiddler. This is a desktop application that you would run and install. It allows you to listen to network traffic, inspect. You can issue GET and POST commands and other HTTP commands. So a very full-fledged, robust tool. If you want to do something that's more in browser, you could go with HTTP Requester, which is an add-on for the Firefox browser, and it works really well. I've used that for some of my projects. I got to say though, my favorite project, or my favorite tool is something called Postman. I am not a fan of the Chrome browser, but I am a fan of Postman, and this is the only reason I have Chrome installed on any of my machines is to use Postman. Here we've got a URL. This is actually one of the Socrata URLs that I found on the Open Data Network that I showed earlier. What I can do here is you can see I can choose what type of command I want to issue. I'm just going to issue a GET command. I'm passing into this URI endpoint here. I'm getting back JSON, as you can see, and I'm passing in this query string parameter for the zone beat of F2. This is actually 911 call data for the city of Seattle. So with Postman here, I just hit send. I get a nice, pretty keyword-based JSON response back. I can go and start exploring this data and get a sense of it before I, start bringing this into my app. So if I'm making a web data connector for this 911 data, I'm ready to go, right? I've got no authentication. I know if I connect to this URL, I'm going to get back this data. So I'm ready to build that out. Now, let's say that the API provider says, no, you have to use an API token. Well, the other thing that Postman makes really easy is I can come in and define headers. Oftentimes, we'll see APIs and they'll say, hey, you give us your token via an HTTP header. We looked at the Forecast.io data a moment ago, their API, and they actually take it in the URL itself, but sometimes they'll say, hey, give us an HTTP header. So maybe they would say, hey, I need to put in something called an API token. That's the name of the header, and the value would be the same value, or I should say the same combination that I have on my luggage. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I've got my header, I hit send, and it would attach that header right there to the request that went out. And obviously, this is just made up here. We saw earlier I didn't have to do any authentication to get data back, so that header is actually just being ignored by the API endpoint here. So those are some things to think about when you're connecting to web data out there. We just talked about some of the authentication methods that we commonly see and some tools that you could utilize. Please check out the Tableau developer portal. It's developers.tableau.com. And check out the other videos in our series on how to build web data connectors. Thank you.